The contrast between Boris Johnson and his vanquished rival, Jeremy Corbyn. Hi there, thanks for joining us once again for Plain English this December 23rd, 2019, and a very Merry Christmas to all of you who celebrate Christmas around the world. I'm Jeff, JR is the producer, and you are listening to the best podcast for learning English. Today is episode number 218, and that means all our resources are available to you at plainenglish.com/218. Just as a reminder, the resources include a free word-for-word transcript, and Plain English Plus members have access to video lessons, translations, flashcards, and the fast version of this very episode. On today's episode, we talk a little bit more about the British elections. You heard about the results last time. Today, we'll talk about what each party promised and what the results mean for the major players. Later on, you'll learn what the English expression for good measure means, and we have a quote of the week. Real quick, before we dive into the main content, are you part of our email program? If not, then you'll want to head to plainenglish.com/mail, M-A-I-L, and sign up. Twice a week, JR sends out additional episode resources to thousands of your fellow listeners. The emails have a summary of each episode, links to the English articles about the main topic, and an explanation of another English word or phrase. So make sure to get all those free resources by signing up at plainenglish.com/mail. On Thursday, we talked about the results of the British election. The Conservative Party, also known as the Tories, won 365 seats against 203 seats for Labour, 48 for the Scottish National Party, and 34 for all other smaller parties combined. That gives Prime Minister Boris Johnson's party an 80-seat advantage over all others. In today's episode, we'll talk about what the election results mean for the big parties and how they each fared against expectations. Let's start with the day's big winners, the world's oldest political party. Boris Johnson's campaign was disciplined and focused. His message was that the Conservatives would get Brexit done. He was able to win the support of many Labour voters without losing too much of his own base of supporters that may not have wanted a hard Brexit. He added promises of infrastructure and social spending for good measure, but he relentlessly repeated his central promise to conclude his country's exit negotiations with the European Union. Voters knew he meant it, too. Johnson struck a compromise with Brussels in the fall. When members of his own party challenged his Brexit compromise, he kicked them out of the party. For better or for worse, when election day came, the British people knew Johnson meant business on Brexit. And after 3 years of deadlock, the word done may have been the one word that sealed the deal. The Labour campaign could not have been more different. Its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is as dull and awkward with voters as Johnson is telegenic. Incredibly, the party was unable to articulate a coherent position on Brexit. The official position was that Labour supported a new negotiation with the EU, followed by a second referendum. But Corbyn refused to even say how he would vote in that referendum, leaving everyone to wonder where the second biggest political party stood on the most important question of the day. Instead, Labour carpet-bombed British voters with policies and proposals to solve problems that voters didn't know they had. The proposals included nationalizing utility companies, nationalizing the railways, cutting train fares, lowering the voting age to 16, making university tuition free, giving additional pension payments to women, enforcing equality among football clubs, providing free broadband internet, and much else. Ironically, many of those individual proposals were popular, but the sum total represented a radical economic shift that wasn't fit for the political moment. Combine that with Corbyn's disturbing affinity for Hamas and Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, and his inability to shake accusations of anti-Semitism, and Labour lost a winnable election in a landslide. Britain has many smaller political parties that don't compete for majorities, but they can be the kingmakers in coalition governments when no other party wins an outright majority. The Liberal Democrats were once the largest of these parties. As recently as 2010, they held 57 seats and were coalition partners with the Conservatives. In this election, they could have positioned themselves as a moderate party against the hard Brexit offered by Boris Johnson, but without the sweeping economic changes on offer by the increasingly left-wing Labour Party. It didn't happen. Although they won a respectable 12% of the national vote, they were decimated in individual races, and they now hold just 11 seats. Their leader, Jo Swinson, lost her seat. The Scottish National Party is a regional party and now holds 48 of the 59 seats from Scotland, further isolating Scotland politically from the rest of the UK. The SNP and Scottish voters were strongly opposed to Brexit, and they will likely push for a new referendum on seceding from the UK, a push that Johnson will oppose. There is one other party that bears mention, and that is the Brexit Party. This was a party formed only in 2019, and its reason for being was to advocate for the strongest EU exit possible. The party took seats in the European parliamentary elections, but did not hold any seats in Westminster. In a shrewd political move, Boris Johnson convinced the Brexit Party not to compete head-to-head with the Conservatives in any district, guaranteeing that the Conservatives would lock up the whole Brexit vote. Had a Brexit party splintered the votes, the Tories' majority could well be much slimmer. Today's expression is for good measure. For good measure simply means in addition to what has already been done. Don't try to take this one literally. Just trust me when I say it means in addition to what you already have or in addition to what's already been done or given. In these cases, you typically have a big chunk of something, which is the most important, and then someone gives a little something extra. So Boris Johnson's campaign focused relentlessly on the message that he would get Brexit done. Over and over, he repeated the promise. He was disciplined and focused on this one measure. Sure, he threw in some extra social spending for good measure, but the primary promise was about Brexit. If you go to New York on vacation, you might visit the Brooklyn Bridge, the Empire State Building, Central Park, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Statue of Liberty, and a few pizza restaurants for good measure. The pizza is good, but it's not the main reason you go. It's in addition. Speaking of New York, bagels are really popular there at breakfast time. You can get a single bagel, but it's common to buy a dozen bagels in New York if you have a family to feed over the weekend. If you buy a dozen bagels, the clerk may throw in a 13th bagel for good measure. Bagels are pretty cheap to make, so if you're already buying 12, why not throw in one more for good measure? That's the thinking there. One more in addition to the 12 you paid for. Today's quote is not a full quote, more of an epithet. An epithet is a disparaging phrase, but it's timely. In Britain, the political parties publish manifestos before elections. The manifesto is the party's plan for what it will do if elected. It's usually a long list of proposals and policy ideas. The party itself draws up the manifesto. Voters select an individual candidate, and the individual candidate's campaign, they say what they believe, etc., but the manifesto is the document that supposedly binds the whole party together. Anyway, in 1983, the British Labour Party had a very left-wing manifesto, which ironically included withdrawal from the European Economic Community, a precursor to the EU. Well, one Labour politician at the time, Gerald Kaufman, felt sure that the manifesto was too left-wing to gain acceptance among voters. He was sure that it would spell defeat for his party. And so he called the 39-page Labour manifesto the longest suicide note in history. And indeed, it was a big loss for Labour that year. This year's Labour manifesto was 3 times as long and even less effective. So perhaps it is the new longest suicide note in history. That's all for today. Coming up next time on Plain English, Garmin is most known for navigational devices in cars. Those are largely obsolete now that we have driving directions on our phones. But you'll be interested to know what Garmin has been developing high above our heads. It's a sort of autopilot for landing planes in an emergency. So that's coming up on Thursday. Don't miss it. And if you enjoyed today's episode, then I think you'll love Plain English Plus, our new membership program. It's the best way to get even more out of the podcast you already know and love. With a Plus membership, you can listen to a fast version of the program, watch a video lesson with each episode, build your vocabulary with Quizlet flashcards, and use our famous interactive translations. It's a great way to build your confidence and train your ear in English. Come join us at Plain English Plus by visiting plainenglish.com/plus, PLUS, today.